Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to demystify a highly technical yet absolutely fascinating algorithm known as UMAP. If you've ever wondered how data scientists take impossibly complex, multidimensional information and basically squish it down into a map that our human brains can actually comprehend, well, you are in the exact right place.
So think about it. How exactly do we visualize the invisible? Imagine dealing with high-dimensional data. We're talking massive DNA sequences, incredibly intricate single-cell data, or even the deep linguistic features captured by AI models like BERT. In their raw form, these data sets are like completely uncharted galaxies. We simply can't see them with our natural senses because they exist in hundreds, sometimes thousands of dimensions, and, our brains are really only wired to comprehend 2 or 3.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the journey. First, we'll look at the big data problem. Second, we meet UMAP itself. Third, the push and pull physics under the hood. Fourth, UMAP versus the competition. And finally, the UMAP family tree.
Starting us off with Section 1, the big data problem, and navigating high-dimensional space.
Navigating this massive, high-dimensional space is absolutely the foundational hurdle in modern data science. That is exactly where dimensionality reduction comes in. Now, these methods broadly fall into spectral, probabilistic, and neural network categories, but our focus today is zooming in specifically on probabilistic neighbor embedding. Basically, these are techniques that try to figure out which data points are neighbors out there in that massive space, and then recreate that exact same neighborhood on a much smaller, visible map. Which brings us to Section 2, Meet UMAP, the state-of-the-art cartographer. It's time to meet the hero of our story, Uniform Manifold Approximation and Projection, or just UMAP for short. Now, while it's built on some incredibly rigorous math, specifically algebraic topology and category theory, its real-world impact is super grounded. It's state-of-the-art. UMAP is out there right now, helping scientists visualize complex genetic interactions in DNA, mapping out the hidden features of natural language processing models, and it's even being used to analyze spectral imaging of fine art. Now, what's really interesting here is how this algorithm literally gets its name from its core assumption. The foundational research explicitly states that it assumes, and essentially approximates, that data points are uniformly distributed on an underlying manifold, or shape, in space. By making this one crucial mathematical assumption, it can project all those scattered points down into a smaller space that we can actually look at.
Moving right along to Section 3, the push and pull, under the hood.
So how does it actually pull off this magic trick? Well, without getting bogged down by dense algebraic topology, in the simplest terms, UMAP creates these fuzzy topological representations of the high-dimensional data. Then it creates a brand new low-dimensional space and iteratively modifies that lower space until it perfectly matches the fuzzy blueprint of the high-dimensional one. It does this by measuring the difference between the two spaces using a math function called fuzzy cross-entropy, and then it just minimizes that difference.
So, the crucial point is how it physically minimizes that difference. I want you to think of it entirely as a game of physics, a literal push and pull. Within UMAP's cost function, there are two distinct forces. First, we've got attractive forces. If 2 points are neighbors in the big space, UMAP uses attractive forces to pull them closer together in the small space. Then we have repulsive forces. UMAP pushes non-neighbor points away from each other. But here's the clever part. To save computing power, it doesn't check every single point. It uses negative sampling. It just grabs a small, random handful of points, assumes they aren't neighbors, and shoves them away.
Let's boil that whole complex algorithm down into 3 really clear steps. Step 1, UMAP constructs a k-nearest neighbors graph from the input data, just finding out who lives next to who. Step 2, it initializes the starting positions using a technique called a Laplacian eigenmap. And step 3, the engine really revs up. It iteratively applies those attractive and repulsive forces we just talked about using stochastic gradient descent, slowly molding the final visual map. Notice this number right here, 15. When we talk about finding k nearest neighbors, 15 is actually the default value in UMAP. And this is a massive highlight because, empirically, UMAP requires a significantly lower number of neighbors to map out the space compared to older methods. It doesn't need to look at everything to know where things belong, making it highly efficient.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds into a rivalry. UMAP versus the competition.
Because, algorithms don't exist in a vacuum, and UMAP has a pretty famous rivalry with another popular heavyweight called t-SNE. The big differentiator here? Speed. Both of these are neighbor embedding methods, but t-SNE requires normalizing probabilities across every single pair of points in the embedding space. That takes a massive amount of computational heavy lifting. UMAP uses a similar distribution, the Cauchy distribution, but deliberately skips that heavy normalization factor. That mathematical shortcut right there, that is the secret to UMAP's blazing speed. It doesn't have to check the whole board every time it makes a tiny move.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really wild mathematical quirk that researchers discovered. When you break down the expected cost function over all epochs, the original UMAP algorithm actually puts way more weight on those negative samples, the repulsive forces, than its own theoretical math expects it to. It pushes non-neighbors away much harder than strictly necessary. It's essentially a technical mistake. Yet, despite this quirk, the results are just phenomenally clear and effective in practice.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the UMAP family tree and custom modifications.
Because UMAP's core engine is so incredibly robust, developers haven't just used it, they've totally hacked it, modified it, and solved entirely new sets of problems. We can categorize these custom variants into 3 main branches: DensMap, which tackles that uniform distribution assumption; parametric UMAP, which hooks UMAP directly into deep learning; and progressive UMAP, which solves the headache of ever-changing streaming big data. Let's look at each one real quick.
First up is DensMap. Remember how UMAP assumes data is uniformly distributed? Well, to do that, standard UMAP effectively cancels out the natural density of the data. If a cluster of data is super tightly packed, UMAP kind of ignores that tightness to make the math work. DensMap fixes this blind spot. It adds a regularization parameter to the cost function to restore that local density info. It preserves the density so tight clusters actually look like tight clusters on the final map.
Next, we've got parametric UMAP. Now, standard UMAP just optimizes the positions of points directly. Parametric UMAP bridges the gap straight into deep learning by replacing those point embeddings with the trainable weights of a neural network. By turning UMAP's cost function into a neural network loss function, it can optimize data in many batches. This is a total game changer, making it highly scalable to massive, nonlinear datasets that would normally crash a standard computer.
And wrapping up the family tree, progressive UMAP. A huge limitation of the original UMAP was that once you build the map, you couldn't easily add new data points to it without basically starting over from scratch. Progressive UMAP fixes this for dynamic streaming data. Using a technique called panning, which relies on randomized K-trees, it rapidly updates the graph and embeds new out-of-sample data points completely seamlessly. It is perfectly suited for the constantly growing nature of modern datasets.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. What mysteries are we going to unlock when we can seamlessly map any high-dimensional universe? Tools like UMAP, DensMap, and parametric UMAP aren't just clever math tricks. They are literally the lenses through which we will decode our biology, understand our most advanced artificial intelligence, and chart the entire future of data. Thanks so much for joining me to explore the elegant structure behind the algorithms that make it all possible.